Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we will be reading Marcus Garvey and the Vision of Africa, Section 8, 7, the Marcus Garvey Revival, 1940 to present, page 388 of the text.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
The Flowering of Black Nationalism, Henry McNeill Turner and Marcus Garvey, an article by Edwin S. Redkey, published in Key Issues in the Afro-American Experience, edited by Nathan I. Huggins, Martin Kilson, and Daniel M. Fox, Volume 2, copyright 1971, Harcourt Brace Jovanovich, Incorporated, New York. Afro-Americans have reacted in different ways to the problems they have faced in the United States. Quite understandably, many have tried to get along as best they can, eking out a living, trying to avoid trouble, never losing hope for a better day. Others have protested to whites, asking for fair treatment, civil rights, and integration into American life. And others have militantly called for separation from whites, unity and pride in the Black community, and a new political arrangement in which they control their own destinies. This last approach, generally labeled Black nationalism, has taken a number of different forms throughout the years, but the classic elements of Black separatism and solidarity, race pride and political independence have always been recognizable. Some Black nationalists have called for all Black states, cities, or towns within the United States. Others have wanted to carve out a separate country out of American territory. Often, Black nationalists have proposed establishing ties with Blacks in other parts of the world and in Africa. Recently, this has taken the form of a sophisticated cultural identification with Black Africa, whose peoples have inspired Afro-Americans by gaining political independence after a century of European domination. In earlier years, Black nationalists urged that a significant number of Afro-Americans emigrate to their fatherland and establish there a powerful new nation. Twice between 1890 and 1925, This back to Africa form of Black nationalism generated widespread enthusiasm among Black Americans. Although few Blacks actually emigrated to Africa, the movement's stress on race pride and rejection of white America was indelibly impressed in many minds and inspired a new generation of militant Black nationalists. Greetings, KW Don 7 and Forecast Radio. How are you guys doing tonight? Conditions in the South in 1890. Although the concept of emigration to Africa to establish a powerful new Black nation had been formulated before the Civil War, most notably by Martin R. Delaney, the idea was then limited to a few Black intellectuals, mostly free Blacks in the North. As a mass enthusiasm, Black nationalists first flowered during the 1890s among the Black peasants who farmed the cotton plantations of the South. It was clear to them that even though it was 25 years after the end of the Civil War, most white Southerners intended to keep Blacks as near slavery as possible. Having built up elaborate intellectual defenses for slavery during the early 19th century, the whites were not willing or able to change their concept of Blacks as inferior, almost subhuman beings. Nor could they imagine for them any role in society other than that of the lowest class, possessing a minimum of rights, power, and status. When ex-slaves tried to assert their rights and privileges as citizens, whites used every possible means to keep them in their place. Violence had been a frequent tool of repression in the days of slavery, and it continued to be used during and after Reconstruction. Lynching was a particularly terrifying means of social control, for it deprived its victims of any chance to prove themselves innocent of whatever charges were made against them. Frequently, they were brutally tortured and humiliated before being hanged or shot or burned to death. The rate of lynchings increased rapidly during the 1880s and reached a peak in 1892. Whatever political power Blacks had gained during Reconstruction, Southern whites now whittled away through violence, fraud, and deceit. By 1890, it had become evident that Northern whites, who had supported the Blacks for political reasons, had grown tired of their efforts and were no longer going to interfere in Southern racial politics. White Southerners quickly took advantage of this development and began formally and legally to strip away what little political power remained to the Blacks. Mississippi led the way in 1890 with the passage of a new state constitution that effectively stopped Blacks from voting. During the next 18 years, most Southern Blacks followed Mississippi's example. Though legally free, Blacks could not use politics to protect their freedom. The economic life of Blacks was also restricted by whites, who, as they had before the Civil War, still owned the land and controlled the economy. Blacks worked the farms and paid a large share of their crop to the white landowners as rent, and the portion of the crop retained by the sharecropper was probably already mortgaged to the white storekeeper for food and supplies. Therefore, after the merchants and landowners were paid off, the farmer was left with little or no profit from the harvest and usually remained in debt. When cotton prices declined, as they did in the late 1880s, or when a general depression gripped the nation, as it did during most of the 1890s, the Black farmer could see little improvement in his situation since slavery. Reactions reactions to this social, political, and economic oppression took several forms. Undoubtedly, most blacks, unsophisticated in business and politics and dominated by the landowner, the merchant, and the sheriff, simply endured the hardships and made the best of a bad deal, no matter what dreams of escape they may have had. The spokesman for this group was Booker T. Washington, who made accommodation an ideology. He urged people to work hard, live clean, quiet lives, save money, and demonstrate their worthiness so that the whites would someday recognize and honor their virtue and thrift. Others, mainly intellectuals and middle class Northern blacks, protested and appealed to the conscience of the nation to grant them equality and integrate them into white American life. Frederick Douglass was the early spokesman for this viewpoint. Others, including W.E.B. Du Bois, followed. But as conditions in the rural South worsened during the 1890s, a significant number of blacks began to despair of ever attaining the good life in the United States. Neither accommodation nor protest seemed to make life any better for the vast majority of black farmers and workers who had little chance of earning enough or learning enough to reach the middle class standard of living. For a time in the late 1880s, some black farmers joined with their white counterparts in the populist movement, which sought better economic conditions for all farmers. But racial prejudice soon split the populace, and the blacks realized that the main reason for their hardships was their color, not their occupation. Many began to dream of establishing a nation of their own where they could be free of white oppression, own their own land, and control their political destiny. The black nation of their dreams would be a credit to the entire race and gain respect for blacks wherever they live. The chief advocate of this brand of black nationalism during the years between the Civil War and World War I was Bishop Henry McNeil Turner. Urban Blacks and Marcus Garvey. During the war years, 1914 to 1918, the general situation of hundreds of thousands of blacks changed radically. Ever since the days of slavery, blacks had looked upon the North as a kind of promised land of political and social freedom. But after emancipation, the economics of cotton farming had kept 90% of them in the South. Bishop Turner, among others, realized and publicized the fact that there was much prejudice and racism in the North, especially among recent immigrants from Europe who were competing with blacks for jobs. Nevertheless, a small but steady stream of blacks, mostly from Virginia and Kentucky, migrated to the industrial cities of the North and founded communities there. With the coming of World War I, however, the labor situation in the North changed dramatically. I-migration from Europe was drastically reduced, while the demand for manufactured goods expanded. Industrialists in Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, New York, Philadelphia, and other cities were crying out for unskilled labor and began sending agents into the South to recruit blacks. Afro-American newspapers also summoned Southern blacks to the new bonanza, while letters from home while letters home from early arrivals lured others still away from their cotton farms. In 1915 and 1916, those cotton farms were having hard times anyway, as the boll weevil marched across the South, destroying crops and making life even more difficult than usual for blacks. The result of these forces was a sudden dramatic spurt in the migration from the deep south to the cities of the north. Almost overnight, major cities gained large black populations, attracted by jobs that paid in dollars instead of credit at the local store, by the growing all black communities inside the cities, and by the relative political and social freedom in the North. Nearly 500,000 black migrants moved into the northern cities by the 1920s, and the tide was to continue for several decades to come. But the North was hardly a paradise for blacks. Friction over jobs, housing, and lifestyles quickly arose, and when the war ended, returning soldiers and new European immigrants displaced many of the black workers. Furthermore, the infamous Ku Klux Klan, with all its virulent racism, was revived and began to reach into the North as well as the South. The expanding black settlements spread from block to block in major cities, displacing whites, changing neighborhoods, and altering political patterns. To these friction-generating changes were further added 400,000 black soldiers who had been away helping to make the world safe for democracy, but who came home from Europe to find the same old racial oppression in the United States. The result was a long series of race riots, many in northern cities, in which blacks invariably suffered the most. During the economic recession that followed the war, urban blacks who had been last hired found themselves first fired and frequently out of work. Although the North still offered more opportunities than the South, and despite the fact that blacks continued to pour into the cities, it became clear that even in the Promised Land, black people were still oppressed. Uprooted from their familiar surroundings, crowded into small quarters in expanding ghettos, shunned by whites, and restricted to the lowest levels of society, some blacks began to recall Bishop Turner's African dream of a free and powerful black nation outside of the United States. Into this urban scene of black newcomers with new homes, new jobs, and new problems stepped Marcus Mosiah Garvey, the man who was to mobilize them in the second mass flowering of black nationalism. Garvey also read Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery. Garvey also read Booker T. Washington's autobiography, Up from Slavery, and suddenly perceived that his own life work was to be the leader of the black race. Returning to Jamaica in 1914, he set about building an organization that would unite 400 million Negroes of the world for the purpose of building a civilization of their own. He called the organization the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League, and began work among the black peasants of his home island. Among his goals was the creation of industrial schools to teach trades and skills, schools patterned after Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute. Central to Garvey's philosophy was the need to unite all black people and to give them a racial self-confidence that would enable them to throw off white oppression. Like Bishop Turner a generation earlier, Garvey hoped to stimulate race pride both by direct propaganda and by the establishment of a powerful black nation in Africa. Whenever he spoke, he urged Afro-Americans to shed the old thinking that white was right and that blacks were powerless. Up, you mighty race, you can accomplish what you will, was one of his mottos. To the thousands of blacks who were caught in the anonymity of the big cities, and who felt as helpless under the grinding wheels of Northern society as they had under the oppression of white Southerners, those words held out new hope. To help stimulate pride and independence, Garvey demanded racial purity. He was himself an unmixed African descent and reflecting the three-way split in West Indian society. He despised mulattoes. Such distinctions between brown and black, however, were not as important in the United States. But Garvey's stress on the glories of the African heritage helped many Afro-Americans, both brown and black, to find a new confidence in themselves and in one another. Garvey advised them not to be too concerned with political rights and social equality in the United States, but rather to become as independent as possible in the white man's country. He organized his followers into marching units of uniformed African legions and Black Cross nurses whose colorful parades inspired thousands of Harlem residents. Economic independence was another factor in the UNIA plan. Garvey urged his followers to buy black, to patronize their own businessmen. Following Booker T. Washington's stress on self-sufficiency, the UNIA opened several business projects, including the Negro Factories Corporation, to assist Black businesses. More important, Garvey founded the Black Star Steamship Line to serve as a commercial and spiritual tie among Blacks everywhere its ships traveled. Like Bishop Turner's shipping attempts, the Black Star Line was intended to carry freight as well as passengers. But contrary to popular belief, carrying immigrants to Africa was not one of the original motives of Garvey's enterprise. Black Star Line stocks were sold to Blacks only, and Garvey promised stock buyers that they would not only be helping their race, but might also make a handsome profit. To the surprise of his critics, Garvey collected enough money between 1919 and 1925 to buy 4 second-hand ships and to begin trade with the Caribbean. For Garvey, the major path to Black pride and economic independence was the redemption of Africa for the Africans. The only wise thing for us ambitious Negroes to do, he wrote, is to organize the world over and build up for the race a mighty nation of our own in Africa. It would be strong enough to lend protection to the members of the race scattered all over the world and compel the respect of the nations and races of the earth. He believed that power is the only argument that satisfies man, and that it is advisable for the Negro to get power of every kind that will stand out signally, so that other races and nations can see, and if they will not see, feel it. The Garvey movement reached a peak in August of 1920 at a month-long convention held in New York City. At least 25,000 people attended the many meetings at which Garvey used all of his oratorical power to proclaim Black nationalism. The emphasis was on the redemption of Africa. The other races have countries of their own, and it's time for the 400 million Negroes to claim Africa for themselves, he announced. And we mean to take every square inch of the 12 million square miles of African territory belonging to us by divine right. Garvey was designated provisional president of the African Republic. Other officials of the UNIA were given similar titles. The convention adopted the Declaration of Rights of the Negro Peoples of the World, which embodied most of Garvey's philosophy. A truly impressive affair in its magnitude and splendor, the convention brought Garvey to the attention of the world. He had managed to do what Bishop Henry Turner McNeil Turner couldn't, and many other Black leaders had failed to do. He had mobilized the Black masses. Thousands of urban Blacks were drawn to the red, black, and green flag of Black nationalism. Many more read the Negro World and responded eagerly to the agents of the Black Star Line who circulated among them selling stock. Greetings, Sister Ra, and the elders listening with her. Thanks for tuning in. Garvey was aware that many difficulties stood in the way of the redemption of Africa. European imperialists controlled most of Africa by military force. Furthermore, the Africans themselves would need help in learning to cope with the powers and problems of the 20th century. Garvey therefore proposed to sending a limited number of Afro-Americans with skills, professions, and capital, 20 or 30,000 families to begin with, to settle in Liberia. Liberia was, at the time, the only independent African nation, and it was governed by an elite group of descendants of earlier Afro-American settlers who ruled the indigenous Africans. After 1920, several teams of Garvey's representatives visited Liberia to lay the groundwork for the newcomers. But the UNIA seemed a threat to these Americo-Liberian rulers, especially after they discovered Garvey's secret plan to take over the country. With the approval of the European colonial powers, which also felt threatened by Garvey's Africa for the Africans policy, Liberia broke off negotiations and refused to allow any UNIA members to settle there. Thus ended Garvey's only real attempt to repatriate the descendants of Africa. The enormous appeal he had for Afro-Americans, however, was not based solely on the Back to Africa idea, although he maintained that the future of the Negro outside of Africa spells ruin and disaster. He did not actually call for mass immigration of American Blacks, but mass immigration to escape oppression in the United States was an appealing concept to many many of Garvey's working class followers, and he did little to discourage their popular misinterpretation of his plans. It was not only the Liberian government and the European colonial powers that were alarmed at Garvey's promises to redeem Africa through his African Legion and his Black Flying Eagles. Many Afro-Americans also opposed the UNIA leader. The Black elite of businessmen and intellectuals resented Garvey just as they had resented Bishop Turner. Labor leader A. Philip Randolph of the socialist journal Messenger thought Garvey's Africa would be a reactionary dictatorship, not a democracy. Robert Abbott of the influential Chicago Defender arranged to have Garvey harassed for selling stock in Illinois without a license. Black churchmen resented Garvey's establishment of an African Orthodox church, which threatened to win the allegiance of Black Christians to a Black God. W.E.B. Du Bois, editor of the NAACP magazine The Crisis, accused Garvey of being the worst enemy of the Black race. Du Bois was then involved in a series of Pan-African conferences which tried to bring together intellectual and upper-class Blacks in an organization aimed at pressing for independence of colonial Africa. Although the Pan-African movement shared some basic goals with the UNIA, Its style was quite different and its membership much smaller than that of the UNIA. Garvey despised Du Bois. The Black elite, or the talented tenth, as Du Bois called them, not only opposed Garvey's Black nationalism, but also criticized the man himself for being uneducated, a foreigner, and a demagogue. Many whites, including federal government officials, also viewed the UNIA as a dangerous anti-American movement. At first, such opposition did little to dim Garvey's popularity with the Black masses, but the Jamaican also had to take his friends into account. Although the UNIA was far-flung, its organization rested chiefly on Garvey himself rather than on strong local leaders. Nevertheless, the UNIA attracted a number of men who saw it an opportunity to gain personal power or profit. At first, Garvey was too trusting of his associates and allowed them to make decisions that later hurt the movement, especially their financial decisions for the Black Star Line. Despite the fact that millions of dollars had apparently been collected from UNIA members, most of it was never actually accounted for. And although the organization eventually bought 4 ships, they either turned out to be unseaworthy or were lost because of debt. The other financial affairs of the movement were also apparently mismanaged, so much so that Garvey's opponents, including some defectors from the UNIA and some disgruntled stock owners, alerted the United States government and charged the Black Star Line was making false claims about its finances. Garvey's opponents were delighted, of course, and they published the details of how the UNIA members and the Black Star Line investors had lost their money. They expected the movement to quickly collapse. During Garvey's 2 years in prison, there was indeed a decline in the activities of the UNIA, for it had been held together primarily by the personality of Marcus Garvey himself. Nevertheless, some local chapters continued to function, waiting for the day when their leader would again rally them to the cause of Black nationalism. But when Garvey was released from prison and tried to rekindle the old enthusiasm from a distance in Jamaica, he had little success. Even though there was a temporary rally, particularly in the West Indies, the damage had been done. Vestiges of the UNIA lingered in the United States, but it was torn by factionalism, dissension, and bankruptcy. In 1930, it had ceased to be a major organization in Afro-American life. Garvey died in London in 1940, still clinging to the dream of a powerful African nation that would unite the descendants of Africa scattered around the world. But this second flowering of mass Black nationalism in the United States had withered. Yet another generation would pass before such ideas again stirred Black Americans. Turner and Garvey in perspective. Greetings, Brother Bakari. How are you tonight? FBA Adolf's been selling out for a long time. They go to Liberia and take over and work with white folks against proud Africans. They are still doing it today. Turner and Garvey in perspective. Garvey's UNIA, of course, received much more public recognition than Bishop Turner's movement. The reasons lie in the differences between their followers. Turner lived and worked in the South, where most Blacks were farmers and where white oppression was much more personal and pervasive. Garvey, on the other hand, worked primarily in the large cities where communications were better, leisure time more plentiful, white oppression less personal, and mass meetings more feasible. Furthermore, Turner's followers rarely saw such cash, whereas the urban blacks, though underpaid and underemployed, were paid cash wages. This made it easier for Garvey to raise money for his operations. In addition, in many UNIA members, having recently moved to the North, found it easy to think of moving to yet another promised land. These factors particularly explain why Garvey rather than Turner succeeded in creating a large, visible nationalist movement. However, Garvey and Turner shared not only a dream of African redemption and Black pride, but also certain personal qualities that influenced their activities. Although neither was superhuman, and each has his glaring weaknesses, both possessed an overwhelming desire to see the Black race achieve honor and equality with whites. They shared a vision of African power. Both were impressive speakers with a flair for the dramatic and a willingness to speak bluntly about white racism and to speak it in the language of the masses. But although Garvey and Turner were competent organizers on a surface level, neither possessed the shrewdness or ability to mobilize his followers efficiently to fend off attacks by both whites and by other blacks. In contrast, Booker T. Washington, the dominant Black leader in the years between Turner's and Garvey's heyday, was able to use people, publicity, politics, and personality to maintain his own power for almost 20 years. Of course, Washington paid a price for that power, namely the humiliation of Southern blacks in their own eyes and in the eyes of whites in return for telling white businessmen what they wanted to hear about happy, docile blacks. And although Washington's power gained him the respect of many blacks, he commanded little enthusiasm among the Black lower class because he had no great militant vision for the future of Afro Americans. But he was a shrewd and capable organizer and manipulator of the ideas of men. In the final analysis, he was the most powerful Black man in American history. He had either Bishop Turner or Marcus Garvey combined Washington's organizational ability with their Black nationalist understanding of what had to be done, the outcome might have been different. Although Turner fought for African redemption and Afro-American immigration throughout most of his long life, he had other interests, particularly church affairs, and did not give his wholehearted attention to Black nationalist agitation. Garvey had only one consuming passion, but his fatal weakness was his failure to select competent and loyal assistants. There were other reasons why neither Turner nor Garvey was able to achieve ultimate success. Each had active opponents and in the end was overwhelmed by them. For just as Turner's propaganda was taking effect in the mid-1890s, Booker T. Washington gained national attention and soon dominated Black leadership. Garvey was overwhelmed not by a new leader with new ideas, but by a concerted attack from his opponents, who succeeded in physically removing him from the scene. Both Turner and Garvey failed to get substantial support from the Black upper class, the small but influential elite who had skilled jobs, professions, or college educations, and who yearned for stability and integration more than race pride. Although Garvey was much more successful in getting money and ships in the end, Neither he nor Turner was able to arrange a strong settlement of Afro Americans in Africa or otherwise create a powerful Black nation. Each man was so aware of the pervasive reality of white oppression and the powerlessness of Blacks around the world that he ignored the necessary details of organization and nation building. It was the concept of Black nationalism rather than its organization that fired the imaginations of Turner's oppressed Southern followers and Garvey's Northern urban admirers. To be sure, there was a major element of escapism in the popular interpretation of Black nationalism. That escapism forced both leaders to include mass emigration in their thinking, even though both maintained that a full exodus was both impractical and unnecessary for the establishment of a free Black nation in Africa. But Blacks seemed to want a nation of their own that would command the respect of the world, an idea that clearly adopted an idea that they clearly adopted from whites, both in the 1890s and in the 1920s, were times of intense nationalism in both Europe and the United States. Southern and Northern whites proclaimed this was a white man's country. The ideas and arguments employed by Turner and Garvey were learned from these whites. Central to the concept of Black nationalism was the unity of all Blacks in all parts of the world. Unity meant more than strength in numbers. The international approach reinforced the nationalist awareness that the root of their problems lay not in racial inferiority, personality traits, or bad luck, but in white oppression. This was true not only in the United States and in the Caribbean, but in Africa as well. Bishop Turner watched in alarm as the European powers established their imperial control over the homeland during his lifetime. Both he and Garvey were early contributors to the small but growing movement for African nationalism among the Africans themselves, a movement that eventually led to their independence. For Turner, Garvey, and their followers, Africa became a symbol more powerful than reality. As the home of their ancestors, it had a strong appeal to Afro Americans, whose knowledge of Africa was clouded by generations of separation and years of brainwashing. New World Blacks easily romanticized Africa and ignored its difficult problems. First, of European control, second, of economic growth in societies that had not yet begun to industrialize, and third, of nation building on a continent containing hundreds of different ethnic groups. Both Turner and Garvey tried to learn about Africa. However, their visions as independent, powerful African nation were more than empty dreams. The primary impact of both Turner and Garvey, of course, was on American Blacks. Black nationalism gave Afro Americans a feeling of independence and power in the face of a suffocating, ever present white oppression. It also gave them a sense of working toward the day when Black men would indeed have their own nations and be respected in the councils of the world. This sense of purpose drew together a people who had been lost in an American society supposedly very individualistic, but actually very group oriented, especially where race was involved. It got some of them, for a time at least, to work together, to dream, to build, and brought a self-pride that mere rhetoric could never have produced. The flowerings of Black nationalism under Bishop Turner and Marcus Garvey left seeds that are still growing. First, the promise of African freedom inspired Africans to work for independence from Europe. Second, the stress of Black accomplishments built a new pride in the Afro American lower class that will one day blossom into a new Black power and independence. So, as you can see, according to Mr. Redkey, there were some problems with both Garvey and Turner when it came to their application of Black nationalism. And idealistically, they would have integrated the savviness of a Booker T. Washington and the humbleness of a Booker T. Washington. But we didn't like it when Garvey tried to play politics in earlier chapters. So, what do you think? Greetings, Oni. How are you tonight? Oni from the Pro Black Perspective. Thanks so much for tuning in. I think that we need to be able to know when our people are playing politics and know when they are not playing politics. I think that not enough information was out there for them to be able to adequately and accurately express the idea that Booker T. Washington was playing politics and that he was using the white people as best he could so that he could build up his school and his institution while he was funding some things on the other behind the scenes that allowed him. I know Dr. John Henrik Clark says that at some point, if you didn't get approval from Booker T. Washington, you couldn't have a job in some places as a Pullman porter, as some of the more better paying jobs that they had available. So I think that we're going to cut it right there for tonight because the next section is quite long. I think we need to consider those three things that he talked about: the nationalism, the nation building, and the need for unity. I think that we need to figure out how to appeal to people that are not wealthy. How do we organize the mass of the working class people? And how do we get the wealthy class to pay for it? I think that the answer, it lies in nonprofits and starting with the children. But there are some other ways that we can do that. I think that we need to move past this idea that we can't use their money or their funds because everybody uses somebody else's money to get their ideas off the ground. You guys know that I am a big proponent of, hey, go find a grant to do what you want to do. I'm in the process of working on that right now. So I thank each and every one of you for listening. I want to thank KW Don 7. I want to thank the Forecast, Sister Rob, Oni from the Pro Black Perspective, and Brother Bakari for showing up today. I want to thank Wana Haguziki, Brother Bakari, the Forecast, Afro Native, Sister Ron, the elders listening with her, Tinkerbell 87, Jesse's Kids Academy, and everyone else that has contributed to the stream. The forecast says exactly what can you exactly use what you can, whatever is available. Did you already say which book won the poll? No, I didn't say which book won the poll. Right now, it's a tie between Up From Slavery and The American Negro. We have 3 more days of this book. So by which we're going to do something different. We're going to read Wednesday, Thursday, and potentially Friday because we missed Monday. So we're going to read Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Friday, we should be on the Negro Rights of the World, will be its own show. So be ready to come on the panel early because I'm going to add inline commentary to that. Whether we have those rights right now or we don't, and what we can do to get those rights. So, no, I have not said which book won the poll, but right now the two that are in the lead are Up from Slavery and The American Negro. All right, guys, thanks so much for tuning in. I appreciate each and every one of you. Peace, guys.